Good morning, everybody. Thanks for making it out here today. I think I know most of you. If there's any I don't know, my name is Chad Aldis. I'm with the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, and we're very pleased you could join us this morning. At Fordham, we've always been outspoken charter school and school choice advocates, but we've also been very clear that a key factor underlying that support is the ability of educational options to lift long-term outcomes for students. With that in mind, we're happy to have CREDO, the Center for Research on Education Options from Stanford University, here today to present the latest student achievement data in Ohio's charter school sector. This morning, we'll have a presentation by CREDO walking us through key findings of their latest report, followed by a question and answer session. It's no exaggeration to say that CREDO has become a go-to national expert on charter school achievement across the country. Before jumping in, I hope you were able to pick up CREDO's report. If you haven't seen it, there's some on the back table, so you can have a hard copy of it. And also, our latest guide to education stats in Ohio by Education by the Numbers, shameless plug. You can also go to ohiobythenumbers.com and get an online access to that as well. So, without further ado, let me turn it over to CREDO's Senior Research Analyst, Chunping for today's presentation.
Thank you, Chad, and thank you all for coming to the event. I'm delighted to give a briefing about our research design and major findings. The primary research question of our study is, what is the impact of charter schools on student academic performance? And apparently, we studied the charter school student performance in Ohio in this study. To address the question, we used the longitudinal data for Ohio students and schools from the school year 2013 to 14 to the year 2016 to 17. Our key outcome variable is the student academic performance. And to measure student performance, we relied on the scores students received on state standardized achievement tests on reading and math. We standardized the student test scores and computed annual growth. Then, we compared the growth of charter school students with the growth of peer students who attend traditional public schools, or TPS. When we make the comparisons, we accounted for a set of factors that may influence student growth. By the way, to help interpret the effect sizes in our impact analysis, we also transformed the standard deviation units of growth into days of learning. Now, let's look at our major findings together. This graph shows the overall impact of charter schools on student academic progress in Ohio during our study period. As you can see, charter school students in Ohio make similar gains in reading during the study period as they would have in the traditional school setting. However, as the orange bar shows, charter students lag behind their TPS peers in math, and the gap is equivalent to 41 fewer days of learning per year. About 30% of charter school students in Ohio attend online charter schools. And we know that online charter schools educate students of different demographic characteristics. So in this graph, we compare the performance of students attending online charter schools and the students attending brick and mortar charters with the performance of the average TPS peer students. So we can see from the left two bars that online charter school students make substantially weaker growth in both reading and math than the average TPS students. The right two bars tell us that brick and mortar students make greater learning gains in reading and grow similarly in math relative to the average TPS peer students. And in this graph, we benchmark the growth of online charter students against the growth of students attending brick and mortar charters. And we see from these two bars that online charter students grow substantially less than students enrolled in brick and mortar charter schools in both subjects. Many charter schools are part of management organizations. And charter management organizations have some operational advantages. For example, management organizations may achieve greater efficiency in operation as they are able to spread fixed costs over a large number of charter schools or students. In addition, with more schools and students, and charter management organizations may be able to offer additional programs or more robust staffing. So whether charter management organizations benefited the learning of students has been an issue of concern throughout the country. So in the analysis in this graph, we disaggregate the impact of brick and mortar charter schools by management organizations and independent operation status. So we can see from the left two bars that the students who attend charter schools that are part of management organizations post greater learning gains in reading and grow similarly in math relative to the average TPS peer students. From the right two bars, we know that brick and mortar independent charter schools do not perform significantly different from the average peer students in TPS in either subject. So in this graph, again, we benchmark the performance of students of charter management organizations against the students from independent charter schools. From the results for these two bars, we see that there is no significance in the difference in the growth in either subject between the two types of charter schools. The performance of disadvantaged students has been an important policy concern in the country. And whether charter schools are effective in educating all student subgroups is also very important because, as we know, that charter schools tend to enroll significant shares of disadvantaged students. The findings from this table show whether attendance in charter schools or TPS makes a difference in the growth of students in the same subgroup. For your information, the numbers in green represent positive impact of charter school attendance. The numbers in red mean negative influence of charter schools. And the numbers in black represent the similarity in the growth of students in the subgroup, regardless of the sector the students attend. Yeah, from the table we can see that black students from charter schools make significantly greater gains in both reading and math as compared to their black peers in TPS. Black students in poverty also post greater learning gains in reading as compared to their peers in TPS. But on the negative side, we can see that charter school students who receive special education services lag behind their special education peers in TPS in both reading and math. In addition, charter school attendance is also associated with weaker learning gains in reading for English language learners and weaker growth in maths for students living in poverty. The academic growth for Hispanic students does not differ by the sector of schools they attend. So to summarize our findings, Ohio charter school students have similar learning gains in reading and weaker growth in math compared to their TPS peers. Within the charter sector, online charter school students underperform both the TPS peers and the brick-and-mortar charter school students. We also found variations in the charter impact across student subgroups. In particular, we found that charter schools benefit the learning of Black students, including Black students in poverty. But at the same time, we found that the charter school attendance disadvantages certain groups, including students receiving special education services, students living in poverty, and English language learners in one or both subjects. So the variations in the charter impact by school types and by student subgroups suggest that there are still successful practices to share and replicate to help the students who do not perform well. And in the meantime, we noticed that the state legislature and the Department of Education have been enhancing regulations of charter schools. For example, in October 2015, the House Bill 2 was passed, and House Bill 2 emphasized academic equality as a priority. So it is worth tracking whether and how the House Bill 2 and other policy changes may affect student learning in the long run. So much for my briefings of our research design and major findings. Thank you very much. Yeah, any questions, comments, thoughts?
What percentage of the charter high schools that you looked at were online or dropout recovery?
Do you mean the percentage of high school students or high schools?
However you did
Yes,
your
yes.
data, if you did it just by student and not by school, I'm just curious as to whether there was a significant percentage of data points associated with dropout recovery or online for the high school level schools, which show less growth than the elementary and middle schools.
Okay, first about the dropout recovery schools. In our data, there are about only 2 to 3% of matched charter school students that belong to the dropout recovery schools. So this accounts for a very small proportion for both reading and math. Yeah, currently I do not have the numbers of the further breakout by high school.
Was that 2 to 3% of high school charter students, or
All the matched charter school students.
So, but then what percentage of all students were high school students, right? Because there are far fewer students in charter high schools.
Right.
So do you know what percentage of charter students attend high schools?
Well, so I do not have the exact numbers now, but you are right. Yeah, the percentage of high school students is smaller because they are fewer tested grades. Yeah.
In 2014, you broke out findings of charters versus traditional public schools by city. You didn't, but you chose not to do that this time.
This time, yeah, we do not have city breakouts.
Okay, is there any particular reason why you left those out, or just you can't do everything at once?
Yeah. Yes, yeah, this time, we do not do, every breakout.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Can you speak to how these numbers compare to other states, the way that their charter schools compare to their TPS students? Is Ohio an anomaly? Is this typical of what you see in other states?
There has been variations in the performance of the schools across states. In our previous studies, we do see positive impact in some states and negative impacts in other states. So, yeah, in the scenario of Ohio, it is on the negative side in terms of math.
Did you see any effect in your study from the fact that the first year of your study is sort of the peak of Ohio charter schools, and starting in 13-14, the number of schools and the number of students have declined? Did you see any effect of that in your research as far as the overall population shrinking?
So we did see a slight decline in the number of charter schools in operation during the study period, but we didn't estimate the impact of the decline on student growth. Yes.
Are these results comparable to the study you did previously in Ohio? And if so, was there a change in performance that you noticed in this study versus the prior study for charter schools overall?
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, in terms of the comparison, this is the third study on Ohio charter schools. We released two previous studies in 2009 and 2014, and basically the pattern has remained similar. So, similar growth in reading between charter schools and TPS, and lower growth for charter school students as compared to TPS peers.
In math?
In math, yes.
A question about your methodology. There's a lot of academic research that shows that when a student switches into a school for the first year or two, there's a negative academic effect of that switch. And charter schools, because they're schools of choice, it would stand to reason that there are more students that are in their first or second year in the new school, and therefore can be expected to have a decline in growth compared to traditional public schools. And I'm wondering if you had considered matching, using as a matching criteria, that mobility factor, matching students who are in their first year in a charter school against a twin who is also in his or her first year in the traditional public school, to see if maybe the weakness you're seeing in some of these results is a factor of that student mobility and not actually the effect of the school.
Yes, actually, our director of CREDO would like to jump in.
Good morning, everyone. I'm lurking in the back drinking coffee today. It's great. So you ask a really interesting question, and your question is about whether mobility is actually structurally associated with a setback. And it turns out that the average mobility effect is the same for TPS as it is for charter schools. And the thing that's interesting about that is that more than 40% of charter schools are able to take transfer students and have absolutely no setback at all in their learning. So the idea that you're going to always see somebody slide in their first year is just that's an issue of practice, that's not an issue of structure. So if schools can take a kid and make sure that they continue their learning from wherever they come in, then there's no structural disconnect when there's mobility. Does that make sense?
Well, I'm not sure. I'd have to fully understand what you're saying. I'm not sure this is the forum for it, frankly, because I don't want to get into a.
Well, so the point here is, just because a kid transfers doesn't necessarily mean that there's going to be a learning loss.
Although, doesn't the research show that it is very common that that's true?
So,
I mean, just.
one more time. Just because there is a pervasive pattern doesn't make it structural. Okay, that is actually that is a matter of practice in the school, not a structural phenomenon. So just because a kid transfers doesn't mean that they're going to have a learning loss. If the school focuses on onboarding in a good way, those kids can slide right in and continue their learning. And what we see is in charter schools, more than 40% of the schools do that. So we don't think that mobility is actually a derailing factor in the charter space. It may be in traditional schools because they don't do that, but what we see is that's not the case. So because we see that, we don't actually use that as a factor in our selection criteria.
I have a question about your choice of putting the Ohio assessment results on a bell curve. The assessments that we and most states are using now are criteria-referenced assessments. Those don't fit in bell curve like norm-referenced assessments do. Can you speak to why you thought you could get good results putting those kinds of tests onto a bell curve where they don't fit?
So the reason of putting the scores in a bell curve is to make the results comparable. So across years, and in our national study across locations. So we standardize the test scores by subject and by grade, so that when we record the scores and the growth of all the students, we have a common metric.
Even though, as you pointed out in the study, the tests were changing continually through that period of time?
So we standardize the test by subject, by grade, and by year. So in terms of generating a bell curve for each grade, each subject, each year, so the changes in the test over a year does not affect our standardization.
The differences in the performance in online schools is that, does CREDO have assign a reason for that? And does CREDO support any kind of a ability for online schools to filter out what kind of students they accept? That currently doesn't happen in Ohio, but does CREDO believe that would help?
So could you rephrase your questions in terms of support of practice or?
Well, first, I guess, why does CREDO believe that the online schools the performance there is so much worse than both traditional public schools and other brick and mortar charter schools?
So this is a good question. So in this study of Ohio, we didn't dive into the mechanism of why online schools perform worse than brick and mortar. But in our previous national study on online charter schools, we found that online charter schools tend to serve students with a higher mobility rate. And the weaker growth among online charter schools in those subjects seems to be very commonly seen in various countries. And it is worth to explore further reasons why this happens.
Have you looked at how the funding could or may not be affecting these results, the increased regulations and laws for accountability in Ohio versus the lack of increase for funding to follow all of those mandates?
This is a very interesting and important question. So we understand that the context during which these results took place, but we didn't directly model the impact of funding or policy changes. We didn't directly model how the policy changes and the change in the funding affect the student progress in this study.
I think that would be a really interesting question when comparing Ohio to other states, whether increased accountability in other states is also accompanied by funding or not. I don't know if you're planning on doing anything like that, but I think that would be something we're looking at.
Yeah, this is a good idea. So we are also doing research on other states. So we will be interested in knowing how the performance of Ohio charter students compared to other states during the same period of study.
Did you separate, I see that charter schools benefit black students. Did you separate the impact of charter schools and black students attending brick and mortar schools versus attending online schools to see how much of a gap there was? Because it seems like overall there was a negative impact for students attending online charters. So I'm interested to know, was there a negative impact for black students attending online charters and compared to attending brick and mortar?
Yeah, this is a good question. So in this study, we didn't further break down the impact for black students by online or brick and mortar charter attendance. But definitely, this question is worth further exploration in future.
Can I just weigh in on something about that?
Sure.
So one of the really interesting findings for me as we did this study was that the student profile of students in brick and mortar charter schools was different than traditional public schools in important ways. But the profile of students in cyber schools, cyber charters, was even different from the profile of kids who go to charter schools. So I'd refer you to the table in the report that shows that
Which page?
It's page 8. Turn in your handles to page 8. Unlike charter school, brick and mortar charter schools, which educate 60% of their students are black students, there's only 13% of black students in cyber schools. And this is a pattern that we've actually seen in other places, where the draw of students into cyber charters isn't reflective of the charter population at all. It's not even reflective of the district population either. So while I think it would be really interesting to do the breakout that you're talking about, the fact that there's only 13% of the students are black, I don't think they're pulling the numbers. I think the negative numbers that you're seeing there are being driven by the white students in cyber, because they represent 75% of the students.
Referring back to my first question about the dropout, the recovery schools and the number of students, would you have that somewhere that we could get it from you at a later time, the number of high school students in comparison to elementary and middle school, and the number of dropout recovery students that are looked at in your numbers, and would we be able to get those from you if we contacted you directly?
Yeah, we can think about that. But as I mentioned earlier, so there are only 2 to 3% of matched charter students in the data set. So yeah, we need to check, well, what is the breakout? What is the further breakout, for example, for high school, for high schools, for online schools? And then we will decide whether there is a sufficient number of cases to do that. Yes, please.
Hi, I was wondering if you had tried to situate these findings with sort of other research designs, because you're using matching, and so you're matching on observables, which is great. But one of the big elephants in the room, white elephants in the room, is sort of unobservables like student motivation, family motivation. So we often might think that parents who want to put their kids in charter schools are sort of paying attention more. And I know for other states there have been studies which have used lottery estimates at oversubscribed charter schools to get at winners and losers, to get better identification. did you sort of look at that possibility for Ohio? Is that not to kind of benchmark the matching, the results from matching, or is that not possible? Because I don't know how many charter schools in Ohio are oversubscribed, so how many are actually using a lottery?
Yeah, so I think you have already pointed out some caveats in the lottery study. So the matching method we used ensure that we can include a more representative charter populations in the study. And also as to your earlier question about some factors that are not included in the matching, for example, motivation and other factors. We do control the starting achievement scores of students. So we take into, we map actually the starting achievement score is one of the matching variables. So we hope that by including that starting achievement, a lot of factors affecting students' prior achievement will have been captured.
Could I also add that there are a number of peer-reviewed articles?
Yes.
One is by our team, but 2 or 3 others are not by our team, that actually do a head-to-head comparison of our matching methodology with lottery results. And we are very pleased with the conclusions that those studies have arrived at, which is that we produce not only equivalent estimates of charter school impacts, but because we are able to increase the number of students that are covered in a study, we actually have greater external validity than some of the lottery.
One thing that I've been struggling to understand is what drives the rationale for merging online and brick and mortar schools together when you do these comparisons? Like, I can't sit here and pretend I have the background to understand if that's necessary or not, but it just seems to me that they're very different kinds of schools to be lumping into one overall report. So what's the rationale? I understand you do this with all of your reports, but what's the rationale for combining online and brick and mortar schools into one report?
So yes, the online versus brick and mortar is an important dimension to make the differentiation. By merging them, so we are looking at different questions. By merging them, we are able to take a look at the overall picture. And yes.
But I guess my fear is that the conclusions that you can draw, if you look at just the headline, is that the majority of students aren't making gains. When you break it down by brick and mortar, it's clear that students are making gains, but then students in online schools are making significantly less gains, which then seems to overall impact the outcome. Am I correct?
So there are different analyses. So the overall impact tells us the big picture of how the charter school students grow relative to their TBS peers. The further breakdown tells us the detailed picture on different dimensions. So I don't think a single number can tell us the whole story of the charter school students in Ohio. So by doing the overall analysis and then by doing different kinds of breakdowns, we wanted to show the scenario on different dimensions.
So also consider the fact that at the moment, the charter school legislation allows for a charter to be used in a variety of ways. And so we're not just looking at, we're always interested in finding out where charter schools are helping students, but part of the overall policy objective of granting charters is in fact producing this other part of the result. And so as long as we are thinking about evaluating the charter policy and its impact on student learning, we need to consider every single time a charter is granted what happens to it. And so that's why we have in our overall effect, the top line results have to include all charters that were granted. And then beyond that, yes. If we also saw, for example, that schools that do multiple grade spans, like K-12 charters, were doing a much better or a much worse job, we would consider that an important breakout too, but we wouldn't exclude bad K-12s from our overall analysis because
I don't think he's asking to exclude them so much as point out the differences very clearly. Right? I mean,
Yeah, I think the difference between the headline and the sub-bullets underneath the headline are significant. I think that's what I'm getting at. It seems like the headline is charter schools are performing at or worse than traditional schools, when there's a very important distinction to make. And that distinction is, I mean, it's made clear in the details. It was just hard to get there, getting past the headline. Does that make sense?
I see your point.
So you found there wasn't a lot of change in charter school performance over time between 2009, 2014, and now. I didn't notice it. Did you really calculate the change in performance of brick and mortar charters versus any change in the online schools? Not just absolute performance now, but how each of those parts of the charter school sector have changed over time. Were you able to look at that at all?
Yeah, for online versus brick and mortar, and at this.
But change. So have the brick and mortars gotten better since 2009 and since 2014? And have the online schools gotten better or worse since 2009 and 2014?
We do not have these numbers for 2009 and 2014.
Okay.
Looking at the figure 6 on page 14, do you have an explanation for why the comparisons versus districts that are considered town districts, I assume that's small cities, large towns, why the gains there are so much worse than all the others, rural, suburban, and urban?
Okay. So yeah, so this is something that in this analysis we use the location designation of the National Education National Center for Education Statistics. So our further examination indicates that some schools these are designated as town by the NCES actually include some virtual schools.
So a lot of those students are virtual students. Is that account for why they're so low?
Right. Yeah, I cannot say this conclusion now. But yeah, our further examination indicates that there are virtual students included in this category. Due to the coding count by NCES.
So when you were doing the typology of where the by town and city and so on, did you go by where the school was located or where the individual students lived?
Schools. Yeah, the location of the schools.
Okay, so for example, ECOT, the big online school which closed last year, that would be listed as since that was located here in Columbus, that would be listed as an urban school, even though it was drawing kids from even rural areas around the state.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yeah, currently according to the coding of NCES.
Hi, I have a question about, do you plan to do more research to figure out why it is that the findings that you have, what is causing these findings? Like, for example, the qualifications of the teachers, the curriculum that's there, the resources that are available, attendance of the students, parental involvement. Why is it that the charter schools are not performing as well as public schools or whatever? Are you going to look further into that, or you're just, what you've done here is you've just stated the facts of how they're doing and breaking it down by race and so on, but are you going to look further into what the causes of those are?
So so these are absolutely interesting questions. So I think our director Macke Raymond will tell you so whether we are going to do that.
So it's absolutely imperative that we have a better understanding of what goes on in schools. Our earlier research has shown that much of what goes on in schools doesn't actually statistically drive results. And so we are continuing to try to figure out what we should be looking at. So teacher qualifications have absolutely no impact on student learning. Just flat out, they don't relate. A lot of practices that schools adopt can either be, the same practice can be helpful or harmful in different contexts. So we've become frustrated with the under the hood studies, and we're pulling back to try to figure out what else we should be looking at, because we don't seem to be able to nail it yet. Your question is absolutely imperative for us to be able to improve schools over time, but we haven't gotten to the point where we can crack that code. So thank you for your question. If you have ideas, let's talk.
Yes.
The graph on page 15 regarding elementary, middle, high, and multi-level schools and the different performance games, I assume that includes both the brick and mortar and online charter school students in there?
Yes, online students are not disallowed in this breakout.
So are the online schools, are they all in the multi-level?
Yeah, most of them are in multi-level.
But the percent of students in online schools at the different grade levels is important too. Can I just ask you for some numbers and you can get back to me? I think it would be relevant to a lot of the conversation that we're having. So on page 46, in your appendix table 1, when you look at students in high school charter schools, it would be really helpful if we could get the number of those students who are in online schools and the number who are in dropout recovery. And then, if I'm going too fast, tell me.
Excuse me.
Yes,
Let me
ma'am.
jump in here and save you from giving a list. We're already in conversation about doing a subsequent study to this one that would focus in on the difference between online and brick and mortar charters. We're not in a position to take a record request from you today, but we are in conversation with both funders and policymakers about doing the study that you're asking for.
I just thought perhaps you would already have those. I mean, when we're talking about the online schools versus the brick and mortars and all of that, and we look back at the situation with ECOT, which most of us in this room are very familiar, the overwhelming majority of those students were high school students. So that's going to have a big impact on the high school numbers that show that high school charter students are not performing as well as their district counterparts. And from what I'm gathering, your report is not at all saying that charter schools fail to perform as well as traditional public schools. In fact, it's saying that we're keeping up and making some gains in charter schools in comparison, in reference to the lady's question from earlier where she said that it's clear, or that we're not, the charter schools are not performing as well. That's not what you're showing. You're showing that we are keeping up. And so I'm just looking to get a little deeper into the numbers. And if you
Understood.
don't have it, that's okay, but if you do, I would love to just be able to break that down further.
So what I'm trying to say is, we are going to produce those numbers. We're going to produce it in a broader context of another follow-on study that we want to do. But given both our relationship with the state and the things that we were agreed to look at, and get the data to use for those purposes, and our relationship with our funders, there's a whole cycle that we're going to have to go through to use any of the data that we currently hold to do any of the analysis that we have not already done. So it's not going to happen instantly, but it is something that we are intent on providing.
That'd be great.
What are the key things you want to look at in that, and what's your best guess on timing?
Oh, Scott, I have no idea. We serve at the pleasure of the state departments with whom we partner to get data. And I have to say, Ohio has been an extremely strong long-term partner to us, but it still takes a long time to work your way through getting a data use agreement. And we will, they're already interested in having some of these same questions addressed. And so we would hope that that would accelerate the approval process, but off the record, I wouldn't put money on that. We'll see. We already have a research agenda that's in the pipeline, so we're going to have to try to fit this in somewhere along the way. We probably aren't going to be able to get to this anytime before fall at the earliest. But assuming that the state would give us permission and assuming that we can get the necessary resources lined up, this is something that we see a lot of interest in Ohio. May I also say, not a lot of interest in any other state we've done any work in that also have virtual schools. So it's a hot issue in Ohio, it's not a hot issue everywhere else. So we're happy to be responsive to your interests and ourselves to do the work, but there's a lot of stuff we got to get lined up in order for us to do that.
Can any conclusions be made about the variability between charter schools versus that of traditional public schools in terms of performance and student outcomes, growth?
So what?
Are there more very good and very poor charter schools versus very good and very poor traditional public schools, or do you not have school as a variable?
So the variability.
Variability.
Okay. So we did not directly model the impact of the variability.
If there are no further questions, thank you very much.